Cambridgeshire Police are re-examining the evidence against 13-year-old James Watson after he emerged as a person of interest.
In 1994, James Watson was a 13-year-old boy from the Welland estate who lived in a care home. Port 19 is from then DC George Barr. He fancied Watson massively. And this was all the stuff we couldn't find in his social services file. He is a strange lad and capable of many things. Caller advised that we were aware of James. No, but no one ever went to see her or take a statement from her or anything.
Action was raised, though?
I just didn't dare.
James had previous convictions for theft, burglary, GBH, and has a perverted nature.
So a teacher at Walton School described him as a very disturbed child who resorts to violence over the most trivial of incidents, and that the day of the 30th of November, Watson had left school at 12:45, returned 15 minutes later with a copy of the local paper, and made the comment there, "This is my mate's brother and I knew him." James was then photocopying the newspaper.
He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't a suspect. He was a witness, alibied out of the original investigation.
I've got a statement here.
Yeah. His own statement, which he provides a week or so after Rikki's body is found, is kind of brief. It's not hugely detailed.
On Monday the 28th of November, I was taken to school as usual in a taxi. About 10:30 a.m, I walked out of school between classes and walked to the Welland estate, intending to visit my father at his home. I was going to cut through into Ragdale Close, but the cut was blocked by a digger. A small boy approached me. I now know that he was called Rikki. Rikki said, "That's a big tractor, isn't it?" I said, "It's not a tractor, it's a digger." I walked through an alley into the next street and back onto Red Mile Walk. I did not see Rikki again.
Still troubled by Rikki's meeting with James Watson on the day of his disappearance, officers trawl the original case files for any clues.
Well, he says that he's wearing a green check shirt and she thinks it's jeans. I remember thinking that he wasn't dressed for school. So I think she's clear that he's not in a school uniform.
James says he's wearing school uniform. I was wearing my school uniform, white shirt, blue tie, grey trousers, navy jumper.
The original investigation worked on the hypothesis that Rikki was still alive during the afternoon on the day he disappeared.
They were convinced that Rikki was still alive, at least at the end of school time.
Yeah.
At that point, they were focusing on the sightings of Rikki at the shops in the evening.
When we came out of the shop, we saw Rikki Neave. He was standing by the wall to the left of the parade of shops as you come out of the shop itself. I know Rikki from around the estate. If those sightings are correct, then James Watson couldn't have killed Rikki because Rikki is still alive when we say James Watson had the opportunity to do that. We've got him going back to the care home, but they would say he never signed out, he never booked out.
But Watson is the only person that day who's actually doing something with Rikki. There are sightings of Rikki walking off with a known person. There are sightings of Rikki being in this location. There is nobody doing anything with him. What's happened from time confirmed with Rikki up to that point with the taxi, Watson's timeline became more and more demanding of scrutiny. A, we knew he'd been with Rikki by his own admission. B, we knew he'd been taxied back to the children's home, but there was this void. Little red warning markers that, hang on, he's really worth a closer look.
The trousers had a tear in them, just slightly below the knee, which could be related to kneeling or being forced to kneel.
I don't doubt for 1 second that somewhere on Rikki's clothing would have been DNA of a suspect, the person who stripped him. But we don't have that.
We have looked everywhere for those clothes. We've searched lofts, we've searched every outbuilding that Cambridgeshire Police own. What we did have was fibre tapings that were taken of his clothing. Our forensic team were able to lift the tape from the sheet and swab it for DNA. And from this piece of sellotape used to look for fibres was the DNA of James Watson.
Now we had something firm, so we've really got to speak to him about it.
He was at his mum's house. It was early morning. He was, in my opinion, pretending to be asleep. We were banging that door for a long time. His mum was across the road, so we ended up going to get her and asking her to let us in.
Yeah, I'll take a key for you. Morning, mate. You didn't hear the door. You're a deep sleeper. Right, James, at this time, I'm arresting you on a suspicion of the murder of Rikki Neave in November 1994. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence. Do not mention, when questioned, something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. I appreciate I've just said a lot to you there. Do you understand what I just said? All right?
There was no, what the hell are you talking about? Didn't really react.
Take those with you just in case you're there a while, yeah?
I'd have been saying, what the fuck are you doing in my house? What do you mean you're arresting me? There was none of that.
Can I just check his jeans now, yeah?
He was compliant, he was polite, he just got dressed and quietly came out with us.
There you go. Yeah, go on.
Okay, can you just do that for us? No.
Could you say it's shock? Maybe. But he wasn't displaying shock, he was very calm.
Right, okay?
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, go
One
on.
of my colleagues now. Let's say goodbye to you, though.
Yeah. There you go. Watch your head.
In any interview, ultimately your aim is to establish the truth of what actually happened.
It was for us to introduce the DNA as our sort of trump card, as our explain this.
I'll ask my colleague to give you a search, mate. Okay?
Okay. Have you got any piercings or anything?
Yeah.
No, just turn on everyone. That's it.
Okay, James, tell us about your involvement in Rikki Neave's murder.
No comment.
Are you responsible for the murder of Rikki Neave?
No comment.
Monday the 28th of November. Tell us about that day.
This was the day that I met Rikki.
Okay. The first thing you refer to in your statement is you walked to the well in the estate.
I think it was just at the time that they were doing a lot of work in there, and
Yeah.
I think they were in the process of cutting off these alleyways here.
Right.
But they were working at the back of these two houses.
Okay.
And it's right here that I remember meeting Rikki, right on this corner.
Okay, so tell us about that meeting with Rikki.
Yeah, as I'm going past, I think he said to me, like, look at that big digger or a tractor, and I corrected him. I said, it's not a tractor, it's a digger.
Right.
Because the lads were in there, excavating and digging. I remember him just looking through the fence for a knot hole. They used to get like the little knot holes that you push through.
Yeah.
Picked him up, held him up over the fence. Watched the guys doing the work, and then we left and walked off.
Let's just go back a little bit then, because I'm slightly confused as to what you just said. You don't make any mention of the defence in your statement.
Yeah.
Shit.
Why is he telling us this now?
Is he taken away the whole element of surprise about the DNA?
He'd clearly taken time to get his story together.
There was no mention of physical contact with Rikki.
He clearly felt that that will get him off the hook.
Picking him up and looking over a fence with Rikki.
If he had been asked the question by the officers, did you pick him up? And then they failed to write that in his statement, one would expect that he would go, I said I picked him up and you haven't put it in my statement.
And that is lacking in that interview. You would expect that of any person to say, I told you this before.
How can you remember that now, that you picked him up, that you couldn't remember back then? That's because you know you've touched the clothing. He suspected we had DNA. Without some form of strong evidence, how do we disprove that?
I was 13, it was 20 years ago. It was an insignificant interaction, conversation that I had with Rick.